Welcome to the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Right now, we're going through the entire Bible to understand it as one big, cohesive story. We're covering one book each day, and this one's about Amos.
Have you ever got to a place where you look at the insanity of the world and you're like, you know what? There's a time in life when I wanted to go fight about all of this, but now I'm tired and the fighting doesn't seem to accomplish much, and I think I would rather just go farm somewhere. So I'm going to go buy a farm, and I'm going to bring some people I love. Maybe I'll just have a family there, and it'll be beautiful, and we'll listen to classical music, and we will not participate in the insanity. If you've ever felt that impulse, then I think you're going to be able to relate to the prophet Amos really well, because I think this guy just wanted to be left alone. He was a dude from the southern kingdom in the mid-700s BC. The southern kingdom, of course, is Judah, and he was alive during the reign of a king named Uzziah, who was, good enough, I suppose. And this isn't exactly a crazy, hectic time in the history of the southern kingdom. It's fine. But on the other hand, up in the northern kingdom of Israel during the lifetime of Amos, you got a guy named Jeroboam II, and he's maybe their rock star king. This is perhaps the zenith of the northern kingdom of Israel's economic achievements, architectural achievements. This Jeroboam guy was really good at war. He pacified a bunch of their ancestral enemies for a time. And Jeroboam II is very shrewd. He knows that rich, fancy, noble people can get real fussy if they don't keep getting richer and fancier. And so he found all kinds of ways that might have involved a little bit of grotesque injustice here or there to keep enriching his cronies and keep everybody in this upper crust ruling class agreeing that they should definitely all get richer, even if they might disagree on a few of the finer points of how they want to achieve that, and while definitely being in total agreement that absolutely oppressing everyone beneath their ruling class was completely moral and justified. So you've got gross injustices going on in the north, but up there in the north in Israel in the mid-700s, it's so far away from Amos, who goes out of his way to explain, I think in chapter 7, that he's not a prophet. He's not the son of a prophet. He's a guy who takes care of fig trees and sheep, and he doesn't really want to be here right now. Yet that's exactly what happens to Amos. He gets roped in away from his life of peace and thrust up into the northern kingdom of Israel to prophesy against them. More on how crazy that is in just a minute. But first of all, if you're like me, you're going through all of these Old Testament prophets right now, and they start to run together a little bit. Now, of course, if we really stop and think, we can separate them out and be like, okay, Joel, that was the locusts. That's right. Hosea, oh yeah, he did the performance art where he had to marry the prostitute. Okay, Ezekiel, he's the guy who had to lay in the street and eat the poop roasted food. Okay, got it. Yeah, I got it. But in terms of message, it all starts to sound kind of the same, right? Like, you were wrong, and God is going to judge your wickedness and evil and atrocities, and Assyria or Babylon or somebody is going to come along, and there's going to be this great grand punishment that is coming, and instead you should humble your hearts and return to God. And I just made that all sound really trite. That's not trite. It's like an age-old, super important message, but because the prophets of the Old Testament, they're presented not chronologically, it can get a little confusing as to who said that stuff first. Well, if we take all the books of the Old Testament prophet section, we line them up chronologically, we discover something really interesting about Amos, and that is that he's the first guy to go and issue prophecies from God against his own people in no uncertain terms. The earliest prophet in the Old Testament is Obadiah. Not everybody agrees on this exact order of things, but we're in the ballpark here in terms of how most smart Bible people would lay these out in order. And then after Obadiah, who pronounces judgment against foreigners, and is the nation of Edom, the kingdom of Edom that Obadiah is getting after. Then after him, you get Joel, who we just talked about. And remember, there's not really a specific target to Joel's prophecy. Maybe a little bit of that is directed against his own people, but overwhelmingly, he's talking about God judging the nations in kind of a grand sense. Well, then after that, chronologically, we've got Jonah. But you remember who Jonah prophesies against, right? It's Nineveh. Well, Nineveh is in Assyria. Those aren't the people of Judah, of Israel. It's not God's chosen people. Well, next up chronologically is Amos. And Amos gets told, you're going to go prophesy a whole bunch of stuff about this age of decadence and wickedness, this gilded age up in Israel under the leadership of Jeroboam II, where everything looks great if you're rich and powerful. But the only reason you're able to be rich and powerful is because you have your boot on the throat of the people who you oppress and crush. And this is in opposition to the will of God. So in that respect, at least among the Old Testament prophets who have books named after them, Amos is really one of the first ones, maybe even the first one, to go right at God's own chosen people with a withering message of critique. Now, it's interesting the way the book of Amos is structured, because he starts off with this little kind of poetic rhythm, and he talks briefly about these foreign people groups and God's judgment for them. And the formula goes the same with each of these. It's for 3 sins of Damascus, even for 4, I will not turn back my wrath. And then he says some stuff about Damascus. And then for 3 sins of Gaza, even for 4, I will not turn back my wrath. And then we say some stuff about that. And then for 3 sins of Edom, even for 4, I will not turn back my wrath. And maybe if you're in Israel or Judah, you're reading this and you're like, it's great. Yeah, stupid Tyre, stupid Edom, stupid Damascus. But then we get into chapter 2, and it says, well, now this is what the Lord says. For 3 sins of Judah, even for 4, I will not turn back my wrath. I'll just read you everything this says about Judah. It's not much, but it's intense. Because they have rejected the law of the Lord and have not kept his decrees, because they have been led astray by false gods, the gods their ancestors followed. I will send fire upon Judah that will consume the fortress of Jerusalem. Well, yikes. I mean, we're just a little bit into chapter 2 right there. If the whole book ended right there, it's pretty effective. I mean, all these surrounding nations that God used as an instrument of judgment against his own people, y'all are going to get it because stuff's screwed up and unjust and wrong and backwards there. But also, Judah, don't you sit over there and laugh all smug like you got it coming too. And so, I mean, really that last verse, right? I will send fire upon Judah that will consume the fortress of Jerusalem. That kind of sounds like he's predicting what happened in 586 when Nebuchadnezzar, almost 200 years from the time Amos is writing this, is going to show up and topple the southern kingdom. So now the only people at this point in the book who can still sit around and giggle about things are those who were up in the northern kingdom under Jeroboam II on their silk pillows and with their fancy clothing, and probably having a good old time laughing at everybody else through 2 chapters and change. But then the prophet Amos turns his attention to Israel, and this many pages are all about everything God has to say about what's going on up there right now, and it is brutal. But back to Amos himself, this guy who just wanted to take care of figs and sheep and be left alone because he didn't want to fight this stuff. He only gets commissioned to speak to his own people of Judah for like, what, 4 or 5 sentences there? I read it to you. It didn't take very long. Instead, he is almost presumptuously being thrust into a foreign country, one that frankly is doing very, very well by all external measures. And he's told to deliver this oracle from God against them. I'm reading between the lines a little bit here, but it looks like Amos goes up north to this shrine in Bethel that Jeroboam II has set up, and he just starts prophesying in front of everybody, like maybe street preacher kind of thing. Again, this is from a guy who just probably wanted to be left alone, but here he is, and he's not preaching to a Job-like situation where everyone's trying to make sense of their suffering. He's doing the even harder thing, which is preaching to an Ecclesiastes-like situation where no one's really bothering at all to try to make sense of their amazing success. They're just reveling in it without any kind of introspection about the injustices they're perpetuating and even intentionally inflicting on other people to keep this fat lifestyle going. But in the middle of all of that, Amos even points out, like, y'all are still going to quote unquote church. You're bragging about the offerings that you give and how generous they are. You boast about them, but, accuses Amos, if you meant any of that, you would quit exploiting people and you would have a modicum of introspection about this system that you've built that is not reflective of the values of God. In chapter 2 and verse 8, with Amos criticizing Israel once again, he says basically, you all lie down beside every altar on garments taken in pledge. In the house of their God, they drink wine taken as fines. The idea being that you're supposed to give a garment, a cloak, back to somebody at night if you're holding that because they have it in hawk or in pawn to you because they're poor and you lent them a little bit of money. But like it gets cold at night, you're supposed to give them back the garment. It's straight up in Exodus 22 that you're supposed to do that. Well, the accusation here is you don't do that. You curl up at night in a mountain in a comfy nest of these garments that aren't warming their actual owners on these cold nights. And the fines you hit them with for not being able to pay you back. Fill your glasses with luxuriant wines while they don't have any. Amos is a masterful wordsmith, and I could practically just read you the whole book, and we could marvel at every one of these vivid pictures that he's painting with words. But for the sake of time, I think we can just boil it down to this. In this time, God had blessed the northern kingdom of Israel, and they were not giving away what God had given to them. They did not have a heart of gratitude. They did not have a heart of compassion. In fact, quite the opposite. They developed a dark heart of exploitation, all while going through this charade of caring about the things of God. And Amos is sent from a foreign country to say that is not going to work. God is not impressed. In chapter 7, we get just a little bit of narrative here. And Amaziah, the priest of Jeroboam II, comes to the shrine in Bethel, and he's like, dude, you can't. You got to stop it. Go prophesy somewhere else. And Amos just goes ahead and turns on him and calls him out as a false prophet. And this is where Amos specifies, like, I'm not one of these prophets that's on the payroll that just says things that are in the national interest. I'm not a bought talking head on a cable news channel that represents one of the parties. I'm a stinking fig farmer, man. I'm not here because this is what I wanted to do with my day. Paraphrases mine at this point. I'm here because thus saith the Lord. And Amos concludes this showdown with Amaziah by saying, you guys are going to get taken into exile, which of course happens in 722 at the hands of the Assyrians. There's one particular image in Amos that I think sort of encapsulates the whole thing, and it's this moment where God is holding a plumb line in his hand, like a string with a weight tied to the bottom, because if you hold that line up with a weight, gravity always tells the truth, and it's going to show you like that's straight vertical. It's a building technique. And Amos looks at it and he's like, yep, that is plumb. And then he goes on to realize like, Israel is not plumb. It's not square. It doesn't square with truth. And the measurer is this ultimate notion of truth held by God. As is the case with pretty much all of these prophets, we still get a glimmer of hope, and we get a nod to God preserving David's line in the very last few verses, where the prophet looks to this future day of the Lord where redemption still comes to pass. But Israel, the northern kingdom, is going to get it. At the beginning of this conversation, I was saying that I don't think Amos went looking for any of this. I think he wanted to just go out to the wilds, let the ick things happen far, far away. And he's just going to farm some figs and raise some sheep. But God saw the injustice and raised him up and was like, you're going to be the guy who I send to deal with this stuff, to speak to it. And I think that comes through kind of subtly in Amos chapter 5, when we see Amos, again, railing against the injustices of the north. You trample on the poor and force him to give you grain. Therefore, you've built stone mansions, you won't live in them. Though you've planted lush vineyards, you won't drink their wine. For I know how many are your offenses and how great your sins. You oppress the righteous and take bribes, and you deprive the poor of justice in the courts. Therefore, the prudent man keeps quiet in such times, for the times are evil. I think the first part of what I read you there is the oracle of judgment of God, and I think that last part is Amos being like, normally you would just want to shut up and put your head down when this kind of evil is going on, but really, it's probably when somebody needs to do something, probably when somebody needs to say something the most. This is powerful, poignant prophecy from a really long time ago, but I think it is still intended to prompt a response in people who read it today. When you visualize the book of Amos, picture that plumb line. When you think about the theme, reflect on how God's character and his blessings toward people is supposed to translate into right relationships between us and right justice. If you don't have time to read the whole thing, make sure to check out chapter 7, verses 7 through 9. That's the plumb line business. And then that last hopeful bit about David's line being preserved in chapter 9, verses 11 through 15. There you go. We just leveled up on a little book with a lot going on. We got Amos a little more situated in our hip pocket at this point. Congratulations on that. On to the littlest book of the Old Testament next time around. That's Obadiah. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.
This podcast is supported by many of you at patreon.com/the TMBH podcast. We're grateful because it supports our family.